Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. It's a potential pact born out of regional recalculation. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Türkiye are exploring a new security arrangement, one that could reshape how forces applied and conflicts resolved across the Middle East. As old security guarantees look less certain, could the region be in for a major shakeup not seen in decades? Safiya Amri explains.
A quiet shift is underway in a region no longer satisfied with the status quo. Last September, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed a strategic mutual defense agreement in Riyadh, pledging to respond if either is attacked, and the framework is already looking to expand. For nearly a year, Turkiye has been in discussions with Riyadh and Islamabad to transform the bilateral pact into a trilateral security arrangement. A draft agreement has been circulated, though no signatures have yet been secured. Pakistan has acknowledged the talks openly. Raza Hayat Haraj, Pakistan's Minister for Defense Production, said a defense pact with Saudi Arabia and Turkey is in the pipeline. Each nation contributes distinct capabilities. Turkey brings a robust defense industry, one of the strongest outside the West. Pakistan adds strategic deterrence, being the only Muslim-majority nuclear state backed by a large and battle-ready military. Saudi Arabia, with its enormous oil wealth and religious influence, holds heavy political clout. The timing is significant. All three perceive a region where Western security guarantees appear less certain and where conflicts can escalate rapidly. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan confirmed the talks, but emphasized caution.
As of now, there are talks and discussions ongoing. However, we have not yet signed any agreement. Our president's vision is inclusive, one that aims to create a broader platform that fosters great solidarity and stability.
Turkey's position is delicate. As a NATO member with the alliance's second largest army, any external defense pact draws scrutiny. Any expanded security cooperation could influence Syria's stability, particularly along borders and in post-war planning. Although no pact has been signed, talks are active and drafts are circulating. If realized, this framework could redraw the region's security map, shifting deterrence away from distant guarantees toward locally enforced red lines. Those accustomed to operating without clear consequences would face tighter limits as security decisions move closer to home. Safiya Amri, Straight Talk.
For more, joining me now from Islamabad is Hannan Hussain. He's a senior expert at Initiate Futures. From London, Neil Quilliam, an associate fellow at Chatham House MENA program. And from Ankara, Betul Akkas, an assistant professor at Ankara University. Well, thanks for joining me. I mean, there's been a lot of whispers about Muslim NATO. I mean, whispers. It has some people excited. It has some people concerned. And before we talk about the potential or the hypothetical, I think we should start with the concrete. So, Hannan, I mean, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan already have a collective defense agreement in place. So can you talk a little about that and why both countries felt the need to sign a defensive agreement together?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think the Saudi-Pakistan agreement is something which I would view as a composite of past fixtures in defense cooperation. For a long time, there was this understanding that, for example, from joint military exercises to defense industrial production, all of that needs to have a future-focused approach, something which brings all of these different components you've seen endure over the decades under one umbrella. And I think that's where the Saudi-Pakistan defense agreement went through. Of course, there were some regional motivations as well. So, for example, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have maintained a long-standing process of consultations when it comes to ascertaining how regional diplomacy kind of plays out. But I think over the years, mounting threat perceptions for Pakistan as well as Saudi Arabia kind of gave enough space to this particular deal, which allows both countries to, A, collectively determine what kind of threat perceptions can they jointly focus on, and secondly, providing a bit of a cover and a cushion for Saudi Arabia to cater to Pakistan's security needs through its levers, which obviously could include financial incentives as well, and for Pakistan to focus on capacity building. So I think coordination of interest right now in wake of regional dynamics is something which brings the deal to the fore. But what gives it concrete shape is the kind of cooperation across defense industrial complexes and all of that, which you've seen endure over the decades. So it's a kind of like a continuum of that process, which you see until now.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, these both actors have different threat perceptions in the region. I mean, Neil, can you elaborate on who Saudi Arabia would view as a threat, who Pakistan views as a threat?
Sure. I mean, Saudi Arabia's threat perception has changed over the years, of course. I mean, Iran used to be the main sort of threat actor, but more recently, we've seen that become, Israel. But for Saudi Arabia, the main concern really is sort of dependency and reliance upon the US as its security guarantor. We've seen over the past, actually 10, 15 years, concern, raised in the Saudi mind, particularly since kind of Obama's pivot, since Obama drew the red line, since Iran, carried out attacks against Abqaiq and Khurais in 2019, and more recently the Israeli attack on Qatar, of course. So Iran, to a large extent, has been sort of managed. The sort of the Iraqi and Chinese brokering of reconciliation between the two has somewhat diminished that threat perception. And now, I mean, quite frankly, Saudi Arabia looks at Israel and sees that as the more complicated actor in the region and the one that can act with impunity. And it could conceivably be on the receiving end of strikes from there.
Mm-hmm. Betul, Turkey has been a part of NATO, for decades, and obviously the premier defensive alliance in the world. So it has its guarantees. Where would this alliance, this trilateral alliance, place within its national security understanding? I mean, how is that going to work? What does this bring to Turkey that Turkey doesn't get from NATO? And I mean, from a threat perception perspective, as Neil explained for Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, what are Turkey's unique threat perceptions in the region?
It's been a while that Turkey is in an effort to diversify its military alliances in the Middle East. But answering your question, the first angle is this framework, I don't think will be something completely replacing NATO alliances. NATO is a primary actor in Turkey's defense and security framework, and it will stay as such. But these, and let's say, for instance, Turkey's relations with Qatar as its military cooperation will not replace any of these bigger structural and systemic security frameworks. But what made actually somehow these states encouraged to this sort of regional alliances, which is called in the press as Muslim NATO, is more like Israeli threat occupied entire regional structure in the Middle East. It's a direct threat for some countries, indirect threat for others, but in general, it brought a big insecurity to the region. And since we haven't seen a big support from Western security frameworks, somehow protecting civilians in Gaza or the attack on Doha, these are somehow triggered the regional actors to diversify their political alliances plus military alliances. So this has something to do with Israel. But in general, other than that, Israel is a big part of it. But in addition to that, these are three conventional armies in the Middle East. So like United Arab Emirates has an army as well, but they don't face a direct threat in the region. They do use proxy wars for extending their security purposes in Africa, in Yemen. But for Saudis, Pakistan, and Turkey, they have direct threats to their land, their domestic security, and their conventional army system is different, and they are the biggest armies of the Middle East. So a cooperation between them is also signals the fact that if they want to form a bloc in the future, I don't think this will be a bloc at the moment, if they have an attempt to do this, then they can move from that. So I think this will be This might be improved by the years, but at this stage, it's more like a signaling to Israel, a signaling to Western powers who are not issuing a security framework to the Middle East in a proper way.
Hannan, what does each individual player bring to the table? I mean, when you look at these three countries, and if you had to say X country brings this to the table, how would you identify the contributions?
That's pretty simple. I think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia obviously brings in unparalleled financial leverage. We've seen that in efforts to further diversify its offering. So I think there's going to be a deeper focus on, for example, how Saudi Arabia kind of plugs the financial element of this deal if it goes through as we plan. On Turkiye's side, I think the defense industrial experience is something which is time tested. We've seen that in Asian markets as well. We've seen that in Indonesia. We also see that in rampant increases in Turkey's overall exports, defense-driven exports as well. So I think that experience, that indigenization, is something which will kind of plug into those industrial applications when it comes to this defense agreement, because obviously having a country which is practiced on that front kind of lends optimism to coordinating expectations even further. And I think Pakistan's front, the focus can largely be on troop deployments and capacity. So I think that has been a strength which we've seen over the decades with Saudi Arabia as well. And that equation has endured until now. And I think with Turkiye, I think Pakistan and Turkiye's individual abilities to coordinate on defenses as well. We've seen that on the naval front. We've seen that in the defense industrial expense as well. So I think when you look at those fronts, Saudi Arabia's financial clout, I think Turkiye's defense industrial experience, and Pakistan's ability to commit troops on a capacity development point of view, including training, is something which qualifies as distinct leverage on all three fronts.
Mm-hmm. Neil, they're calling it the Muslim NATO. I mean, obviously, it's way too early to give that type of identification, but could you see this trilateral forming like the bedrock or the foundation of an alliance that could be called the Muslim NATO?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this is, as Betul had sort of suggested, I think at the moment it's more about signaling. It's more about signaling that there are these three countries that do recognize regional threat perceptions. I'm not sure. I very much doubt that it would extend sort of the membership, as it were, and even at the moment, I mean, we've seen alliances in the region shift and change over the past decade. The Gulf states, for example, they effectively ganged up, or at least a gang of four ganged up on Qatar from 2017 until 2021, January 2021. I think we're going to see shifting alliances. So this is more probably a convergence of interests for the time being, which makes sense, and as Hannan has sort of mapped out, we can see where there are clear sets of interests and what they bring to the table is very clear. But I mean, I think it's a mischaracterization to call it a sort of a Muslim NATO and think that it's going to get 3 or 4 or 5 additional members.
Mm-hmm. Betul, I want to ask you about shifting alliances. I mean, when you have something like this forming, at least when we look at NATO historically, this kind of anchors the alliance, so you don't have those shifting allegiances. Could this anchor allegiances going forward? And also, the Turks and the Saudis, I mean, they were in a normalization process around 2021, 2022, 2026, a potential collective defense agreement. That's quite a big step. I mean, that's something normally reserved for the closest of allies. I could see the Turks and the Pakistanis signing something like that because they do have a lot of military cooperation. Is the Turkey-Saudi Arabia relationship ready for that big step?
That's an excellent question. I think this is something first we need to look at before even discussing the further security cooperation. So, as you mentioned, there has been tensions between Riyadh and Ankara, especially after the Arab uprisings, because the way they would like to manufacture the politics of Middle East has been completely different. There was a logic of differences between them. But yet, by the end of Al-Ula era, like then when they de-escalate with Qatar, Turkey and Saudi Arabia also came or renavigate their perceptions for a pragmatic purpose, because both of these states, they do need each other for properly settling the status quo of Middle East. If you would like to see a stability in the Middle East, you need to have a power of centers who are agreed on certain facts at least. And I think Riyadh and Ankara have agreed on that. Plus, they do have an economic cooperation, and but more importantly, since for further defense cooperation you need a trust building process. Turkey has this with Kuwait, with Qatar, with Oman, but they do have more military cooperation with Qatar because they have the highest trust building process. With Saudis, what they have done in the last 2 years, they did have more cooperation in terms of intelligence sharing, and they had the biggest defense agreement with Turkish Baykar and Saudi national defense sector. So this is somehow was the initial step to renavigate their security and foreign policy relations.
Hannan, when we look at this potential alliance, any country in the region that would view this alliance as a threat, obviously, the one detail that jumps out right away is Pakistan's nukes. So is Pakistan looking at this as, I have the potential to create a nuclear umbrella, and I have the potential to now be a big player in the Horn of Africa, deep into the Levant, normally geographies where Pakistan is not really part of the geopolitical calculation?
I think on the nuclear front, Pakistan will be a bit cautious because it believes that there are different levers for it to exercise its influence. So you talked about certain countries which take you into the Horn of Africa. I think there the larger unique aspect has been to kind of size up a market gap, which Pakistan is using to step up its defense exports as well. So I think on Saudi Arabia, being slightly mum on the nuclear front, because from Pakistan's perspective, using that nuclear umbrella to kind of strengthen regional partnerships, develop stronger conventional capabilities is something which would, I think, be on the forefront as well. Because if you talk about the nuclear front, if Pakistan was to kind of take that away as an offering, then obviously it would kind of signal a larger move towards giving away what it has always seen as a principal symbolic deterrence measure. So I think that would obviously raise a lot of eyebrows, could also risk isolation with the United States, which has obviously been very, very focused on Pakistan's nuclear program. So I think on the larger front, this is more focused on, for example, it gives Saudi Arabia what it wants. So the nuclear projection is something which obviously tacitly comes into play. This saves Pakistan the effort of kind of going overtly from that, which would obviously introduce a lot of costs, especially when the regional climate is also focused on, is very sensitive around the nuclear issue. We've seen that with Iran, seen that with Israel. It'll be bad timing from Pakistan's perspective. I think on the other front, it's also constrained. So, for example, even if Pakistan was able to go through with that, the idea is to make this particular proposed partnership mutually beneficial. And I think on that front, when you talk about Turkiye's offerings to Pakistan and how those align with Saudi Arabia, it's more about coordinating expectations around comparative trade-offs. And trade-offs is something which Pakistan on the nuclear question simply cannot afford.
Mm-hmm. Neil, if this alliance is formed, which countries would it attract as potential members in the future? Because obviously, if you have a new grouping, a new security grouping, there's going to be regional members taking a look at it and saying, oh, I want to be a part of that. Who could you see aligning themselves with the security understanding of Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Türkiye?
The first country that jumps out is Egypt, of course. I'm sure Egypt and we were talking about how Saudi Arabia has reconciled with Turkiye since 2020, 2021. We've seen the relationship with Egypt move very positively in that direction, and Saudi and Egypt clearly have very close alignments and common interests, as they increasingly do with Turkey, particularly in the Horn of Africa. So I think Egypt would be one of those countries that would probably be first in line. I don't necessarily see the Gulf states. I think Gulf unity is an issue, and we can see at the moment with the division between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, none of the remaining states really want to sort of line up behind any of them. They don't want a Qatar crisis again, though. It would be very interesting to see how Qatar sort of reviews this relationship. It clearly already has a very strong bilateral relationship with Turkey, but it could be a potential member there. Jordan too. Jordan possibly sort of stuck where it is, right in the middle of the region, facing a series of common threats, and sort of its threat perception from Israel has multiplied over the past 2 years, and its options look increasingly limited vis-a-vis its relationship with the US. So I could sort of see Jordan maybe not being at the head of the queue, but certainly being behind Egypt and possibly Qatar.
Mm-hmm. Betul, in about 2 weeks, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is going to be in Riyadh meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Obviously, always a big visit when these two leaders meet, but when you have whispers of this type of security alliance in the background, obviously there's going to be a lot more eyes on Riyadh and what's going to be coming out of that meeting. Now, are you expecting any type of major development from that meeting, or any steps being taken towards an alliance coming out of that meeting, or will it just be normal, classic bilateral talk?
As far as we know from Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan's narrative, he stated earlier this week saying that Turkey now is in a process of negotiation for this pact. So, and 2 weeks is a good time for it. Definitely, there might be an official process or events signing this in Riyadh, maybe having Pakistan, of course, along with Turkey. And I think in terms of the time period now we face in Middle East, in terms of insecurities and instabilities, what's happening in Yemen, there is this tension between Emirati and Saudi regional interest. We are talking about Sudan, again, scapegoating Emirati policymaking in Africa, because they also recognized, Israel is recognized Somaliland, which is also an ally of UAE. So I think in this complex map, and including the fact that Turkey is cooperating with Riyadh in Syria, I think we might see this coming in this visit, or we might see an assurance from these two leaders stating that they have a joint understanding of ongoing security threats in the region. Because although they did have serious issues before, in the last couple of months, I think due to what's happening in Gaza, in Syria, in Yemen, in Africa, now we have seen them in a more joint understanding of regional threat. So I think they might use this visit as an advantage. Even if they haven't signed it in this visit, I think they will mention the potential security cooperation in this bilateral ties.
Hannan, aside from Muslim NATO as a branding, I've also heard Muslim Security Council as well. Can you see this grouping in the future working together as a political bloc for conflicts? I mean, we've seen what the UN has done, or not do actually, in many of these conflicts. And the OIC, obviously, very big, wide, encompassing group, but there's been a trend towards minilaterals in diplomacy, whether it was the Astana group, Trump now forming a board of peace, countries coming together for Ukraine. Is that a trend that we could see these three countries working on and moving forward with for regional issues?
In my view, I don't think that's a trend that's going to materialize, because when you talk about multilateralism, that kind of confines the interests of the majority to a few. And I think the goal on actual Muslim representation would mean coordinating expectations along these lines across all these countries. And I think that's where the divergences lie. For example, even if you look at Iran's treatment of late, the US and Israel, all those tensions, there are competing expectations within the GCC about how we want to deal with the issue overall. And then when you look at the broad umbrella about how Muslim countries have been approaching it, you talked about, for example, the peace board and all of that. Over there as well, at the bilateral level, you could see some sort of distance between what is being said as their motivation for joining a board like that and elsewhere. So I think over here, if you want to kind of accelerate the potential for it to be something which is truly, a manifestation of how problems need to be addressed, then I think a couple determinants would need to come into play. First of all, Pakistan and Turkiye and Saudi Arabia would have to, for example, set up a track record of potent defense cooperation which has traction with other countries. So, for example, when we talk about Qatar, when we talk about the UAE, if we're going to look at this as a test case and see how that advances forward, I think that will kind of increase inroads into getting those countries on board. Secondly, I think the complicating factor is the United States' existing security guarantees. So, for example, when Israel attacked Qatar, we did see that the United States, through back channels, was deeply engaged with Qatar to give them additional guarantees. So I think with those kind of tracks happening in the Middle East, the developments are far too fluid for them to be concrete. But I think these three countries consolidating their interests among themselves can kind of set up a nice test case for how defense cooperation ought to be managed. The kind of traction that this cooperation gets would be then an afterthought based on that arrangement.
I'm really enjoying listening to all three of your answers because this is a very intriguing topic, especially for me. I'm really enjoying it, but unfortunately we're out of time. Neil, Betul, Hannan, thanks for joining me. Thanks for helping me unpack this. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.